My book, The Art and Making of Fantasy Miniatures, is available now. Check out the link in the description to find out more. I feel like this channel is nothing if not a record of my descent into madness as book's creators tear my soul and sanity asunder with ceaseless increasing new displays of both unconscionable scumbaggery and inconceivable fuck-uppery. Not even that they're incompetent or unworthy for their profession, just that human beings could so lack their consciousness or conscience that even a single brain cell should afford them, yet their consumers adore and reward them for their bullshit. And today we have a tale that illustrates both the embarrassingly negligent and the heinously exploitative practices of publishing. But let's start at the beginning, which, like all tales of terror and madness, starts out unassuming and maybe even favorable. So in 1984, Sanjulian released his first art book of his work. It was pretty good. You may want to check out the review I did on that one first. But then, over the next 35 years, he only released a couple of really shitty, worthless art books, if you can call them that, until 2018 when a Kickstarter was launched by Big Wow Art to produce a new collection of his work, both in hard and softcover. Now, many of the ideas behind this book are outstanding. It contains about 300 pieces of art, well over double the previous monograph. Personally, I also like the selection of images here much better too. It leans more towards fantasy pieces than the historical romance curation of the first book. But regardless of which curation you like better, the best decision of all is that, except for maybe like 3 or 4 pieces, there is essentially no overlap in the works they contain. That alone is worth a huzzah. So uncommonly thoughtful and intelligent to make the books work together rather than against each other and doubling up on what fans already have. So Master of Fantasy Art really feels like a companion second volume to the first book. However, even though it does contain more fantasy art than the first book, it's not just or even mostly fantasy art. There's a ton of other stuff present. So the book's subtitle is poorly chosen and a little misleading. The only text in the book is the 1-page bio, 2-page introduction, and the captions which just label the images. Now this book is not perfect, plenty of little missteps. First, although it contains 305 artworks for 312 pages, for art of this type that's certainly possible but not optimal. The sizing and layout are mostly fine, but there are some unimpressive areas of inefficiency. Each chapter opens with a completely blank page that could have been used for art. The occasional odd layout choice, it particularly drops the ball when spreading one image across 2 pages, though surprisingly and thankfully this is a technique that is kept to a minimum. Also, there are cases where too many pages are given to works that I don't think are as invaluable in inclusion. For example, full pages of pencil work when the final painting is already in the book feels like a waste that would have been better used to display more paintings. Ditto things like using 4 pages for monochrome portraits of each of the Beatles when, personally, I don't even think they should be in here. But even if you disagree, you could have put all 4 on the same page and that frees up space for 3 more paintings. And the reason I'm stressing this is because there's so much amazing Sanjulian stuff not published in any of his books. The other slightly unimpressive thing is the paper quality. While not a problem, it is dangerously close to magazine quality that does not feel appropriate for the quality of the artwork printed on it. But as far as issues go, this is to a pretty typical degree you can expect with most art books, nothing seriously impacting it. But then there's one bigger problem the book has, and that is the number of pieces that are horrifically blurry. Only a minority, not enough to spoil the whole book in my opinion, but enough that it's an unimpressive and frankly embarrassing feature that they should be held accountable for. However, despite these slightly frustrating issues putting a dampener on the potential high opinion of this book, nevertheless it's still overall good enough to the point that as a fan I'm happy to own it. So nothing out of the ordinary really, and that seemed like the end of the story. But then, just 3 years later, a new publisher, The Book Palace, announced they would not only be republishing Master of Fantasy Art, which would be great because the 2019 version only had a very small print run, but even better, they would be fixing those poor reproduction issues, plus be adding even more art by removing the dumb blank pages and a lot of the pencil art I mentioned. Obviously, I was annoyed at the prospect of having to pay another $1 million for a book I basically already owned, but that ire was directed at the original publisher, who should have had to give me my money back to pay for the new version. But towards the new publisher, I couldn't think more highly of them taking on the task of fixing the book and making sure that at least now and for the rest of time, Sanjulian's work would have a great book. Too bad it turned out this was a bit of a Trojan horse operation devised by lazy, scummy morons. Because remember, we're talking about the publishing industry here. They don't do nice and sensible things. They want to put in the least amount of effort to milk every penny from you and go out of their way to make problems where you wouldn't even think they could exist. So yes, they fixed the reproduction issues, which was all they had to do. That was all they needed to do. But instead, they also decided, you know what, while we're down here fixing stuff, we should also screw up a bunch of stuff that wasn't an issue and no one asked for, to the point that the 2022 version is actually worse than the 2019 one. How? How is that possible? What nightmare am I living that people can be this inconceivably terrible? It is a sanity-shattering impossibility that cognizant beings can do this without the malicious intent of ruining my blood pressure. But then on top of that, they're getting paid for it by me. Perhaps that's the twist ending, that the real idiot was actually me all along, because if it is impossible that people could be this unaware and negligent, then the truth must be that it is an intentional, sinister, business-minded decision, which makes sense if you consider the following. So basically the specific major issue of what they've done is that the 2022 edition, despite having the same title, is not the same book as the 2019 version. The amount of art they've removed and changed is not just a slight nitpick, it's to the extent that they are 40% completely different books. Now, lest you think, well, maybe they just removed the low quality images because the original paintings might be lost or whatever. First of all, not a good idea anyway, but second of all, not true. They removed images that were fine in the original. They've just done it for no goddamn reason other than to frustrate and exploit fans, because now you have to buy another expensive book despite the fact they're mostly the same content. Because if they'd just done what they were supposed to and clean up the original book, people who already owned it wouldn't feel the need to give this new publisher any more money rebuying it. So they could have just additionally created a whole new volume, but that would require they put in a whole new book's worth of effort, which why would they do that when they can take a product that already exists and just put in the minimum amount of effort required to entice fans into rebuying their book? That's just smart, efficient business. It's also a giant middle finger, and they expect you to pay for it, which they can because it works. No one holds them accountable. In fact, they're usually praised for it. Ultimately, I don't know whether the Book Palace's preposterous changes to the books are the result of them being dumbasses or assholes, but I suspect both. So I don't actually own the 2022 version, because I guess even my fanboy desperation has a threshold where something is too bullshit for me to pay for. Thankfully, Dan, over on his channel Rave Sensation, has done a flip through of it, and very kindly let me use some images from his video to make a little slideshow showing the pieces that are exclusive to each edition. If you want to see the full flip through of the 2022 edition, you can watch Dan's video. He also does flip throughs and commentary for all sorts of cool books, so you'll definitely want to check out his channel. It's even hard just to compare both editions page for page since they reordered stuff for no reason, but hopefully this slideshow will help you decide which version contains art you like better if, like me, you don't want to get both. Personally, despite the blurry images, I far prefer the selection of the 2019 version. That's based on my interest in the Conan and fantasy-related pieces, which the 2019 version has more of. Speaking of which, it also works better with the 1984 book because it has less overlap. The 2022 version increased that overlap by including the Conan pieces that were already in the 1984 book, meaning the 2022 version is even backpedaling on one of the best things about the 2019 version, that it had so little overlap with the 1984. Now, I would have said that including those Conan pieces was a good move from the perspective of saving Conan fans from having to buy the 1984 book, which had so little of that. However, they nullified that advantage by then also removing even more Conan stuff that was in the 2019 edition. It's just an onslaught of nonsense. I cannot understand why they felt the need to mess around and change so much of the curation for no reason. Like, I set up how a lot of this stuff has probably been done to exploit fans, but there are changes that don't even account for that. They're just thoughtless, pointless lunacy. For every step forward they took, they also take a bigger step back, and then another completely unnecessary step to the side. By which I mean the 2019 version has some cases of cropping images, which is a condemnation I forgot to mention. The 2022 version fixes some of that, showing the full image, but it also takes pieces that were already full in the original and has now cropped them. But wait, there's more. Further displays of their despicable, deceitful nature, the Book Palace advertised and even wrote back to inquiring consumers, including myself, that this new version would contain many more images. Obviously, you would assume that means they're taking everything from the original and then adding to that, and they know that's the interpretation of their claim. However, after the fact, you can see how it's disingenuously, ambiguously worded so that many more images can just mean images that weren't in the first edition, not necessarily that the book also contains all the originals or even a greater number of images, because guess what? It doesn't. So even though what they were telling fans wasn't perhaps technically an outright lie, that was the intent and result. Because remember how I said it was cool they were going to also clean up some of the waste which they could use for new art? Well, they did that. Blank pages, a lot of pencil art, and even 3 of the Beatles removed, freeing up a whole bunch of space for new work. So a great step forward. But now it's time for the even bigger step back, because they also increased the number of instances where a single image is spread across 2 pages, another display of their boundless laziness and ineptitude, spoiling one of the better things the 2019 version did. But they've now used so many of those that despite all the new space they had available, the 2022 edition actually has less artwork than the 2019 version. How was that possible? Are my dramatic expressions of this book's bullshit starting to feel legitimate? So yeah, that's another reason I prefer the 2019 version. I not only think the selection of works is better, which is probably helped by it also having more art and more pieces exclusive to it. Also, the front-back cover of the 2019 one is way better, being used to show pieces not included in either book, unlike the 2022 version, which uses images that are not as cool, but also appear in both books. They even had the goal to release a deluxe edition of theirs in an attempt to suck even more money from idiot fans. So yeah, the 2019 version was handled by people who made some minor and even one embarrassing mistake, but they are understandable mistakes. Maybe this was their first book and they're things that they could have learned from, especially because they also showed some really cool and thoughtful ideas how to make a good, honest art book. That's not the case with the 2022 Book Palace version, and I have to assume that their name refers to the type of palace where the family are all inbred despots.